So this week, of course, we had the worst mass shooting in the history of our country. And, the situation in Las Vegas was just gut-wrenching to me. It was, looking at reports and seeing pictures, it was really, really difficult to look at. To just see that level of pain and suffering and panic, as a humanist, it's unthinkable to me. I can't even begin to fathom what would drive someone to do something so horrific. How morally bankrupt do you have to be to take that many lives? I don't know. It almost makes me want to look into any studies from psychologists who study these types of people. But I mean, how do you study them? How do you even begin to grasp what the hell would drive them to commit such an atrocity? Because, I mean, there's no logic, there's no rationale that can justify their actions. So that, seeing this incident unfold, man, it was really tough to watch. And I know you all feel the same way, of course. And anytime there is a mass shooting incident in this country, it just makes it more and more clear that the United States needs to reform its policy with regard to gun ownership laws. And no, I'm not talking about repealing the Second Amendment. I'm not talking about confiscation. I don't support these things. What I am talking about is moderate gun control that we've seen implemented in countries like Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia. They've implemented policies that work, which is why when you look at statistics, specifically the shootings per 100,000 residents, you'll see that the United States, I mean, we are way beyond any of, comparable countries. So we've got to do something. So the need for gun reform, of course, it's apparent with these tragedies, but the Las Vegas shooting also made it clear that we also need to reform when it comes to another area, and that is healthcare reform. So Zaid Jilani of The Intercept explains that this morning, Clark County Commission Chair Steve Sisolak set up a GoFundMe, a private crowdfunding platform, to request charity for those injured in the massacre. Nevada's Republican Governor Brian Sandoval vetoed legislation over the summer that would have allowed Nevadans to buy into the state's Medicaid program. Asking strangers for charitable donations to tackle medical bills is ubiquitous in the United States. A report by NerdWallet released in 2015 found that $930 million of the $2 billion raised by GoFundMe since its 2010 launch have been related to medical bills. Yet, NerdWallet's comprehensive survey of crowdfunding sites found that barely 1 in 10 medical campaigns raised the full amount they asked for. Yeah, so that is the reality of the situation in America. Immediately when these types of tragedies happen, we have to think about how the victims who were injured, and there was over 100 people, are going to pay for the medical bills that they will inevitably receive. Now, even if we're not going to move towards a single-payer healthcare system in the near future, you'd think that after tragedies like this, Congress would pass bills that would take care of the medical expenses for the victims, right? But I mean, as you saw with 9/11, Jon Stewart had to shame Republicans into voting to provide healthcare to first responders. I mean, there's so much that needs to be done when we see tragedies like this, and the things that are needed to prevent these types of tragedies, and what's needed to be done to take care of the healthcare bills for these types of tragedies. It really is demoralizing, right? Besides just the heartbreak, it's demoralizing from a political aspect, because it really makes it feel like we have so much work that, a lot of people just might feel inclined to give up. And I know this week, seeing everything that happened, it was so daunting, so discouraging, so depressing that, sometimes it just makes what little progress we've made feel insufficient. And of course, it's not far enough, but we're working on it. And clearly there is one issue that I think is preventing reform in all the areas that the U.S. needs to reform. And of course, that's money in politics. The reason why we don't have a single-payer healthcare system is because the health insurance industry buys off politicians. The reason why we don't have gun reform, even just reasonable, moderate reform, such as universal background checks, which 90% of the country supports, is because the NRA has bought off an entire political party. And if they so much as question whether or not we should consider doing something like universal background checks, then what happens? well, that politician's career is over. Unless we get campaign finance reform, unless we get a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United and mandate public funding of elections, it's going to be really difficult to accomplish all these things. But certainly we have to fight individually, and we have to know that there's one overarching goal that we all have to be cognizant of, and that is campaign finance reform. Even though, when you're kind of down in the trenches fighting for single-payer healthcare and gun reform, it's so easy to lose sight of what makes this fight so difficult to begin with, and that is money in politics. So I really think that, the takeaway, at least for me, politically, besides the heartbreak with this tragedy, is that I think we need to have a renewed focus on campaign finance reform, and that goes, without saying, because if we don't, then these mass shooting incidents will continue, and, we're going to have to resort to GoFundMe in order to pay for medical bills, and we shouldn't have to do that. So look, I apologize for my thoughts being scattered. It's just that this was such a tragic thing to see. I don't have to tell you guys that, it's difficult to really come to any resounding conclusions and have, a specific takeaway. But look, my heart's breaking for everyone. My heart goes out to the families of the victims and anyone who was there, who's now traumatized for life. My heart goes out to you. My thoughts are with you. But more importantly, we're going to be fighting for you politically.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Humanist Report.